from the beginning here. Alrighty, here we go. I got to stay audible. Is it okay so they can hear me if I take this off? Okay. Yeah, I have trouble. If I talk loud, which I tend to do, into the mask, it all comes back into the glasses. I'm going to take my jacket off too to display the T-shirt here. This is a design by Bob Beddix, who coined the nickname Secret Squirrel of the cave I'm going to talk about. And since about 2018, a biologist and a group of our students from Henderson State University in Arkansas, where I live, so it's a long drive to go caving here, we've been the Secret Squirrel Science Squad. I write about this little tiny scientific discovery that has big implications in Hidden Nature, which came out last year. That was the beginning of it, but I've got data as recently as last week to share with you today, so I'll try to get to that. Water and oil, a small weird place in a larger Tennessee cave system. Let me give you just a quick glimpse that I hope I don't get in trouble for of the map. This is a cave in the Highland Rim of Tennessee. It's in TCS. It's in Gerald's book, which I gave a fabulous review to, but he gave a fabulous review to this one, so I guess we're even on that now. But landowner relations are very, very delicate, and whenever I approach some of the cavers who are doing the still ongoing survey work, Jim Fox earlier this year climbed a dome and pushed into a virgin pit and they didn't have enough rope for it. And last I heard, they're still waiting to come back and survey what they can see as walking passage below. So it's not done yet, but the cave as a whole is a very interesting place. I'm only focused on one tiny little pool that's very, very interesting within this cave. Whoops, I had a blank slide in there. I threw this together just before coming here. Okay. As I say, this is an alias for the actual cave name. I'll tell any of you what it is. Most of you probably know if you're curious, but if you don't, I'll tell you privately, but I'm not allowed to say publicly. I promised. It's over 12 miles, I can safely say, ongoing leads. And this is a small pool. And let's see, I got to pull that up. Oh wait, that's not it. That's April Fools from Chuck, a Photoshop caver, and a Tennessee Passage. Hang on.
That's Capshaw cave, Bill.
Capshaw, a Cookville classic. Okay, so here, oops, wrong pool also. That's Lake Castrovalva in Lechuguilla. But it's not unrelated, and I'll explain why it's not unrelated in just a minute. Here is our actual study area. It's called the Petroleum Passage, PP for short. When this was first mapped in the late 2000s, this part of the cave, it's a perched pool above an active stream. It's a multi-level section of the cave. There is a I'm not a microbiologist or a geologist. One of you geologists. What's the name of the kind of fault that goes just sideways? A slip fault. Okay, it's a sideways fault. There's a fault in that area, and this multi-level rift seems to be somewhat determined by the fault, which becomes important. But what cavers noted as they approached this area is a smell of oil, and just a strong petroleum smell. The water is crystal clear, a few inches deep, and there are these little black patches here and there. Although as you walk in, the water turns cloudy and bubbles with weirdness, which I'll talk about in just a second here. Okay, they named these tar patches. And this photo was taken in January it was either Hal Love or one of the people on Hal's trip. Is anyone here who was on that trip in January? Okay, well, I think Hal took it, but Hal took our first water samples. We have really 9 microbial samples, 9 swabs of a Q-tip, and 5 swabs of water. over 3 trips, one in 2018, one in 2019, and one in 21. So the science is quite nascent here, and that's why we started out with just some undergraduates in a DNA lab at my university and a biologist there who's done a lot of cave studies, mostly in Central America, a little bit in Arkansas too. But anyway, the first thing I noticed when I saw photos of this area before I went here are these brightly colored crusts around the edges. And they're different colors. They're sort of white in near the blackness that they call the tar patch, and then orange around the edge. Sometimes you get some little brown patches. It reminded me of the concentric rings you see in hot springs like at Yellowstone National Park, and especially in caves with unusual microbial communities. Now, as I say, I'm not a scientist. I'm a journalist and a professor. I teach writing, but I've been hanging around the scientists in a lot of caves. And so every once in a while, I pretend to do science. And it all started in Lechuguilla, which I first entered to write about in the late 1980s. And, you know, Lechuguilla is unusual in so many ways, but especially the gypsum crusts that are everywhere on the walls. And if it's not gypsum, then it's manganese. What they call it gorilla shit. It's kind of a slimy black substance, but it's unusual. And then there's the famous chandelier ballroom with selenite chandeliers coming out of the gypsum in weird places. In the 1980s, one of the things that I wrote about and became fascinated with is something that was then very controversial. It's now pretty well accepted. And that is, you know, we've got, every time it's raining and you're on the plateau, you know, hey, they're making new caves because the rain's going down and carbonic acid is dissolving the limestone and the streams are flowing underground where we can pursue them. But some caves, especially it seems in areas near where there are known petroleum deposits, at some point in the past there were acidic springs rising from below. And this was the theory of hypogenic speleogenesis, meaning caves formed not by the acid in rainwater, but by a stronger acid rising in these springs. And it turns out that stronger acid is probably coming from microbial communities. And a woman who really pursued the microbial history of this at Lechuguilla is Diana Northup, and also Penny Boston. And in the early 90s, I started going on their trips as a Sherpa, just so I could see some of the places they were sampling and begin to understand what's going on there. I can't believe it, but it was 22 years ago this month, I published my second book, which was called Dark Life. And a lot of folks at NASA were very interested in this because these kind of ecosystems in these hot springs deep below the surface could exist today beneath the surface of Mars, beneath some of the moons of Jupiter, beneath the icy moons of Saturn. And so they were very, very interested in studying this life, which some scientists refused to accept for the first few years, but they kept finding more of it. This is Villaluz in Tabasco in the state of Mexico, and I went with Louise Hose, Diana Northup, and Penny Boston. They are what they call the slime team because they look at these slimy microbial communities are part of it. And in this cave, which is above a known oil-producing area, there are not only springs with the petroleum smell, but there are gas vents of hydrogen sulfide, and it's poisonous in there. You have to wear a gas mask. You have to carry an electronic beeper to warn you when you get low oxygen levels or high hydrogen sulfide levels. Yet it's full of life. It's known as the Cave of the Fishes locally. They have an annual festival where they haul out huge baskets of tiny fish. You know, most caves you do that, you're never going to see another cavefish. Every year they come back, and they're all feeding on this microbial community that is digesting sulfur in many different ways. And they have these famous formations called snottites. These are microbial mats. You blow on them, they sway in the wind. Each one has, the microbial community has about 2,000 different species that are coexisting and basically eating elemental sulfur and some other minerals from the cave and secreting acid. the pH has been measured repeatedly on the tips of these snotites at 0.0, which is unimaginable in nature. You bump against it, you're going to look like a cigarette burn right there. And I have little holes in the cave shirt I came back from that trip with. Anyway, okay, this is not Tennessee. Let's get to Tennessee. But first, like I say, I'm a journalist. I'm not a scientist, but I hung around them long enough that gradually, if I said, hey, why not try this, I got to be on the paper with them. And this was a paper from Hazel Barton, some of you may know, and Norm Pace, some of you may know, both wonderful cavers, but also amazing scientists. And in 2002, she started pushing this idea, which she has her own lab now from pushing the idea, that the chemistry is what drives the life in any remote location. And if you understand the chemistry, then you'll understand the life, and some of it can be very, very odd. And I got in the habit from following people like these in caves for looking for evidence of that unusual life that feeds off of the unusual chemistry. Chuck, I forgot to set my timer. Will you tell me when I've got like 5 minutes left? Because I'll go all day otherwise.
I'll just wing it because I'm actually using my cell phone to record audio.
Okay. Somebody yell at me if I go too long. But I'm going to read just one short passage. This is a photo that showed up on Facebook with just the caption Bloodstone. It was on Joel Buckner's Facebook page. Joel's not here today, is he? Okay. He and I had worked on a project starting in 2014 to try to find the back door to a long cave that old fellow over there had explored, and Troy Kukla did it instead of us. But anyway, we became Facebook friends, and he posted this and named it Bloodstone, and I kind of freaked out, and here's from the book, I wrote a paragraph about it. It looked like someone had butchered a chicken on a boulder. Blood-red liquid flowed around red raised pebbles, centered in what appeared to be the yellowish remnants of past mayhem. Yet I knew at a glance that this colorful liquid did not indicate the ghoulish rituals of some underground cult or anything else done by human hands. It was not even a liquid. Solid calcite had bled across the rock, doubtlessly spreading over a period of decades rather than seconds. It shimmered in the camera's flash, my past experience suggested, only because a tiny film of clear water clung to the crimson surface. This water served an unseen ecosystem in a place far from daylight and chickens. What I saw might be the tip of a living iceberg. And so I immediately emailed Joel and said, where is this? And he said, I can't really talk about it. I said, well, has anyone done any science in this cave? He said, not really. Ben Miller did a 3-hour trip one time, and that was it. I said, would you be interested in having a microbiologist survey this area? It looks interesting to me. And he said, yeah, sure, why not? I'm going to have to talk to the other guys. So 6 months later is how long the talk took. I finally got in there, and let's see. Oh, I can't go.
The arrows on the keyboard, left, right.
Okay, left, right. There we go. Okay, so during this period, Bob Biddix had taken that photo, it turned out, and he'd taken a lot of the photos in the cave, as he does all over Tennessee. And I asked him for to access some of the photos that showed the unusual colors, and this is some of what I saw. And this is another of these tar patches just beyond where that pool is. And there's also a lot of orangish and yellowish formations in the cave, and sometimes that just means there's a lot of iron, but it can also mean something interesting going on. But then he had some other photos that were taken after I first started corresponding with this group. These photos were from like 2018 or early 2019 of things that looked like lechuguilla, gypsum totems. I had not seen those anywhere in a cave this side of the Mississippi standing up like that, or chandeliers like this one. And a lot of the things in this cave seem to me to be a weird Tennessee parallel of some of the geology and chemistry and biology that goes on in lechuguilla. And so, I'd asked Joel about it, and he said, well, the weirdest thing about this cave is the tar balls. I said, tar balls? And it reminded me, I went to another cave that's known for, the original cave where the theory of hypogenic speleogenesis originated is Lower Cane Cave in Wyoming. and it's got these little black patches that you can stick your arm up to your elbow and pull it out, and it's like a jelly-like black goo. And it turns out that's entirely microbial, and it's entirely, again, the cave is in a known petroleum producing area, and a lot of the microbes are related to those associated with oil producing areas. And I'll show you how this is important in a minute. Anyway, my friend Jamie Ingman, he has this very active undergraduate group running his DNA lab, and so he had some money to send them to do field work, and that guy's in med school right now on the right, and actually that's my son Chris, who I snuck into the trip with a couple of other of their students. He was a grad student at the University of Arkansas at the time, and we collected some swabs in January 2018, and then we looked at 3 of those. We did another collection in May of 2019, and here's some of what we found. Because the undergraduates, they're quickly graduating and going off to grad school, Jamie let them reveal little bits and pieces of our information at different conferences. They've now produced posters and slideshows at 2 national undergraduate conferences and 3 regional undergraduate conferences. And this is just the first page of one of them. Again, with the Bob Biddick photo, he very kindly let us use the photos as long as it's for science of one of the typical, little rooms and borehole type passages here and there in this cave. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the science because I'll get it wrong, and most of you will be bored by it. Any of you who understands this and want more information, email me and I'll send you stuff. But what is important is this phrase OTU. It stands for Operational Taxonomic Units, and it basically, you take a swab, you stick it on something, and then you run it through an analysis of a particular segment of DNA, and if it's a 97% match to any known species or all the way up to phylum, then it'll tell you. And remember the little rings? The greatest number of species were in the border between the yellow part of the ring and the white part of the ring. And in places like Lower Cane Cave and Yellowstone, that border represents an area where there's lots of different microbes fighting over the same bit of food, and lots of other microbes eating the poop are the ones who can tolerate the nastier stuff closer to the pond. Anyway, the petroleum pond water, these are the identity counts, and the yellow ring and the white ring had lots of them. And let's see, again, I'm not going to go through all of this, but we found known species that are normally found only at hydrothermal vents, mostly in the Pacific Ocean near Japan. That's the only previous place they've been found. And here we are in Middle Tennessee with the same thing. One of the species, and these are Archaea, some of them, these are methanopyrales, which means they eat methane. There's ammonia oxidizers, hyperthermic sulfur oxidizers, deep sea thermal chemolithotrophs. Chemolithotrope is a rock eater. It eats raw chemistry, and they're sort of the base of the food chain. They existed on Earth long before photosynthesis became the base of the food chain we're familiar with up here. But they were the original base of the food chain. And one of those one of those deep sea chemolithotrophs, the one place it had been collected was Lake Vostok, which is beneath the Antarctic ice cap. And there's only been a little bit of sampling in this huge pristine lake that's under over a kilometer of ice. I think it's like 2 kilometers of ice. And yet, here we are in Tennessee. Why are we getting such weird stuff? Here's one that's reported from speleothems in Tennessee and Italy. It's what Hazel Barton said, that chemistry drives a life. And there's an organization, since I wrote that book 20 years ago, that is a lot of scientists in many different fields, and they're sharing their data, and they call it the Deep Carbon, is it Deep Carbon Registry, or it's a Deep Carbon something, and they've got like 500 papers where they're finding these same species from deep sources all over the planet. There's evidently this deep biosphere which occasionally bubbles up, whether it be in mid-ocean vents or volcanic areas or somehow in a Tennessee cave. And that's what makes this an interesting thing to study. Okay, yes?
Can you do it in 5?
I can do it in 5. We're almost there. I only did.
I'm deeply fascinated.
Yeah, and I know, and I get on this stuff. I can go all day. I'm not going to read from the book anymore. No more science. But I do want to point out one thing. This on this pool. This is a juvenile Tennessee cave salamander, and I have to blow it up, but there's 3 more here. When I was there, I saw, it seemed like about 20 juvenile cave salamanders, but when Hal was there in January, he took more time before they muddied up the water, and he said that there were easily over 100 juvenile cave salamanders. But he guessed there were literally thousands of millipedes on the wall, and I saw lots of tiny flying insects. We have no idea what they were, dipping in and out of the water. This is a long way from the entrance. This is not near any possible surface entrance, according to Hal. These are things that you usually find within 1,000 feet or so of an entrance. And so our guess is that they're feeding off of this microbial community and have chosen to live much deeper in the cave than these organisms normally live. But you walk through and you muddy it up, and here's the tar balls. They're actually little black dots of oil that pop up from the surface. If I had more time, I'd show you a video, which when they pop up, it's sometimes like opening a champagne bottle. They effervesce, and lots of gas bubbles up with them, and it stinks to high heaven, and the oil spreads out. So,
that video. I think we want to see it.
Well, the other problem is it wouldn't fit on my little thumb drive, so I'd have to access the internet.
Sorry.
Email me, and I'll send you a link to my Google Drive. It's really cool. But anyway, so Hal collected some of this stuff. As I say, the first time we were swabbing for microbes because it looked interesting. It was interesting, but we need to understand the chemistry. So we recruited a chemist, Eric Pollock, at the University of Arkansas. He did his master's degree on cave chemistry, but now he works for the biology department as a biochemist, and he was the perfect guy to look at this stuff. And in January, while they were doing an exploration trip, Hal collected 5 water samples for us, some of them very, very oily, like that one. Now, in many caves, this would mean it's pollution. We got to get the state involved. We got to figure out who's dumping oil here. This is a wilderness area. There are no structures above it. There are no gas stations, oil pipes, old oil storage tanks. And we found out finally that it can't be oil from the surface anyway, and here's why. Again, not going into the science, this is a gas chromatograph, mass spectrometer readings, and Eric is used to seeing crude oil, and he sees it from Oklahoma, and he says it's these long chains of, I forget, hexanes and carbon-bearing molecules. And in places like southern Arkansas or the Oklahoma-Arkansas border, they're a little bit degraded and messy, but they're still long chains. Our chains from the pool, he said, are a real mess that he doesn't understand because they're very, very short compared to what you normally get from crude oil. And he says they have been massively degraded by something. And it turns out a couple of the bugs that we got genetic kits for have been used commercially to remediate oil spills, such as in the Gulf of Mexico, because they eat oil. And that's what's been going on here. These are the oil. There are certain carbon rings that are real hard for them to break down, so they're still there. But a whole lot of the original molecule has been consumed by organisms living there. Well, as I say, the water got nasty whenever Hal was collecting it, and this is my last slide if I can get to it. Come on. There we go. We had a hitchhiker. One of those vials had this little juvenile Sally in it. And we didn't have a collection permit, so we got in touch with the state of Tennessee, and they said, well, if he was an accident, you can go ahead and study him, but get him to someone with a collection permit. And we asked one biologist who wasn't particularly interested, but then we asked Matt Niemiller, is that how you say his last name? Yes. And Matt Niemiller's very interested, and he's going to come work with us and be part of the sign. He'll get a t-shirt and everything. And he identified this is definitely a Tennessee juvenile cave salamander, and it's definitely unusual to find it so far in the cave. And one thing he hasn't done yet we had to freeze it to ship it to him, and that's just happening now. But he wants to look in this poor little guy's gut and see what he was eating, because that might tell us some things about his food chain. And that's it. I'm done. And if you want to read more about the beginnings of this, and also read about that old fellow over there and this old fellow over here, young guy there, I got some copies of these to sign and sell today, and anything I sell today, 10% goes to TCS.
Do we have any questions? Because I mean, I'm full of questions at this point. What about y'all?
And you can ask Mary about all the many errors in this.
Yes. One quick question. You said that they knew that the hydrocarbons that they were finding were not crude oil distillates like you would see in the surface from refined petroleum products?
Well, we only knew that when we got these chemistry results, which literally was just last week. But Joel was convinced, because he's worked on this cave a long time, and there's an artificial entrance that he spent a lot of time digging on, and he can't imagine any way for some kind of pollution to get into the cave from the area above where the cave is located.
But there was nothing in the chemical studies that differentiated it?
Well, the chemical studies, they show these weird hydrocarbons that you would not find in, say, an old oil storage tank. It's kind of a unique environment in terms of the chemistry of the hydrocarbons there. They smell like oil, they look like oil on the surface, it looks like you've got a transmission leak, but it's not ordinary crude oil. And certainly, the other thing that's common in this area that Joel and Hal have both heard from locals and ridge walking is that whenever somebody drills a new water well, they get a strong petroleum smell when it first comes up, but after they run the water a little while, that goes away. So, you know, there's not a commercially viable oil source anywhere nearby, I certainly hope for the sake of the cave, but there are little bits of it that are getting into different places. And also, last thing about this cave, I didn't go that far because I'm too old and slow for those guys to go to where the chandelier is, but I went part of the way down that passage, and there's a strong airflow. The wall, I noticed, was crusty, like a Lechuguilla wall. You could poke your finger into it, a big solid limestone wall. And this is something I sampled. It's been in the sample bag ever since. We're going to analyze it one of these days. But this is just a crumbly crud where you would expect solid limestone to be in most caves. Again, I think that's a sign of corrosion with aerial-borne microbes slowly degrading the wall and making it rust away, as happens in Lechuguilla all the time. So that's why I thought it was kind of cool. Any other questions? Yes?
When you said the oil would come up to the surface and disperse, was it a colored film or was it just smaller droplets?
It was small droplets that would come up as, you know, as round globules, and then they spread out slowly on the surface.
Did they stay looking as globules, or was there?
They stay looking as globules. Joel says he's seen them floating on the surface even before they step into it, and they're undisturbed until they step into it and mess it up. But when you're actually standing in the passage, they start wisping around and kind of disappearing. And also, there's this smelly gas that comes up with it. And Eric, who's our chemist, is going to come up with a plan to analyze some of that gas in the future and see what gases they are in his mass spec. Any other questions? And I've also got my business card back there if you don't want to buy a book, but you want to email me questions or anything else. My email's on it, and I'm a TCS member, so you can look me up that way.
Thank you.
Thank you.